Foreign policy is likely to feature prominently at the Republican presidential primary debates. At the debate in August, a question on whether the candidates would support continued U.S. assistance to Ukraine produced a firestorm. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who had previously suggested that Russia's war in Ukraine was not a vital national interest, appeared skeptical, calling on Europe to do more instead. Entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy was more direct in opposing such aid, calling it disastrous for the United States to be protecting against an invasion across somebody else's border. Former Vice President Mike Pence and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, on the other hand, expressed strong support for assisting Ukraine, effectively standing behind President Joe Biden's efforts to counter Russian aggression while imploring the United States to do even more. On the other side of the aisle, some Democrats have been wary of Biden's policy on Ukraine, as evidenced by a letter that was later retracted, sent to the president by progressive Democrats, calling for a diplomatic end to the conflict and potential sanctions relief for Russia. In today's polarized political atmosphere, such cross-cutting views may appear confounding. On most domestic policy issues, whether political leaders have an R or a D next to their name is often a pretty good guide to their take on any particular issue. But when it comes to foreign policy, the normal rules of politics do not apply. Instead, of much greater relevance is where a political leader falls on the foreign policy ideology spectrum. The schools of thought that make up this spectrum, reflecting fundamentally different views about the U.S. role in the world, are highly influential but not very well understood. In seeking to differentiate between foreign policy positions, the media often resorts to clichés such as hawks versus doves, or buzzwords such as isolationist and neoconservative. However, these terms tend to be oversimplified or exaggerated and convey little useful information. International relations theories are not all that helpful either. Realism is routinely conflated with an academic concept that predicts how nations can be expected to behave, rather than how they should. And other theories, such as idealism and constructivism, offer limited utility in understanding real-world decision-making. Yet there are critical differences in how policymakers view the world and are seeking to influence the direction of U.S. foreign policy. There is a clear dichotomy, for instance, between those who believe that U.S. influence is mostly positive and that the United States should play an active role in global affairs and those who believe that U.S. hubris more often leads to bad outcomes and want to scale back the country's overseas commitments. There is a significant divide between those who believe that the United States should prioritize efforts to advance democratic values and norms and those who believe in defending more narrow strategic interests. And there are disparate views on whether the United States should stand firm against adversaries, such as Russia and China, or should seek to find common ground. I have delineated 6 distinct foreign policy camps that represent the dominant strains of thinking on the U.S. role in the world. These camps can be placed along a spectrum of international engagement. 4 of them fall on the more assertive side of this spectrum, constituting internationalists who believe that the United States should exercise its influence and be actively engaged in global affairs. And 2 of the camps are non-internationalists who believe that the United States should scale back its global commitments and adopt a less forward-leaning foreign policy. Several key points follow from this analysis. First, admittedly, the edges of these camps are fuzzy, and policymakers may often find themselves straddling one or more of these camps, especially on specific issues. Nevertheless, these 6 schools are sufficiently discrete and represent the primary worldviews that are influencing the contemporary debate on how the United States should conduct its foreign policy. Second, many of these schools tend to cross partisan lines. Democratic internationalism, for example, has been enthusiastically embraced by political leaders on both sides of the aisle and has strong bipartisan constituencies, as reflected in pro-democracy institutions such as the International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute. Realism has also had a long tradition in U.S. foreign policy, resonating with national security practitioners across both parties. Similarly, the restraint school draws support among both progressives on the left and libertarians looking for Washington to scale back its global commitments. On the other hand, unilateral internationalism has found a home mainly among conservatives, while multilateral internationalism draws support mostly from liberals. In recent years, retraction has become the policy of choice among pro-Trump Republicans. Third, determining where recent U.S. presidents fall on this spectrum is not axiomatic. While they may be inclined toward a particular camp as they enter office, most presidents are not purists, and as they govern, many find themselves running up against practical and political realities that make it difficult to maintain a consistent and predictable foreign policy governing philosophy. Barack Obama, for example, seemed drawn toward realist internationalism, pursuing a reset in relations with Russia and later declining to commit U.S. force to hold Syrian President Bashar al-Assad accountable for his use of chemical weapons. But given the priority Obama placed on engaging adversaries such as Cuba and Iran and working through the United Nations, the main thrust of his foreign policy appeared more consistent with multilateral internationalism. George W. Bush also straddled various camps. In launching the global war on terrorism, Bush seemed determined to assert U.S. primacy and appeared to be leaning toward unilateral internationalism. But with his emphasis on democracy promotion in Iraq and Afghanistan, his signature freedom agenda, and his call for ending tyranny in our world in his second inaugural address, Bush's overall worldview appeared to be more grounded in democratic internationalism. Where Biden falls is still up for debate. Currently, the Biden National Security Team is split between realists who pressed for Biden to withdraw from Afghanistan and re-engage with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Sultan, and Democratic internationalists who championed the president's initiative to organize a summit for democracy. However, given Biden's steadfast commitment to work with NATO to defend a democratic Ukraine and his conviction that the world is facing a global struggle between democracy and autocracy, the broad arc of the Biden administration's foreign policy so far seems to be more consistent with democratic internationalism, though a more definitive judgment will have to wait until his presidency concludes. So where does this leave the current slate of Republican candidates? Pence and Haley, as well as former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, all of whom have called for standing up against Russian aggression and have denounced China's human rights violations, are squarely in the Democratic internationalist camp. Donald Trump, of course, has his own lane. DeSantis and Ramaswamy, on the other hand, appear caught between realism and Trumpian retraction, as they battle for support among the Republican rank and file who are skeptical of U.S. global engagement. DeSantis favors a pivot away from Ukraine and toward China, a very realist way to think about trade-offs. Ramaswamy, who has called for a strategy to split Russia and China, also sounds like a realist at times, but his stance on extricating the United States from any involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war, potentially ceding Taiwan to China, and putting the interests of America first seems to suggest he is veering toward retraction. While voters may not consider foreign policy to be central to their vote for the next president, how U.S. leaders choose to engage in the world is critical to the security and prosperity of the American people. By gaining a clearer understanding of the most influential foreign policy schools of thought, voters and indeed the candidates themselves will be in a better position to make informed choices.